Hey there, deep diver. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Today we're going to be tackling international criminal law.
Ooh, exciting.
Specifically, show trials.
Okay.
And we've got some super insightful research here by legal scholar Martti Koskenniemi to guide our deep dive.
Sounds fascinating.
Yeah, definitely thought-provoking stuff, and I think it'll leave you thinking long after we're done with this deep dive. So
yeah, I think the big question that we're looking at today is, can show trials actually help restore justice?
Right.
It seems almost like a contradiction.
Yeah, it does.
Like show trials and justice, but
Yeah.
when you look deeper, there's a lot more to it than you initially think.
Yeah, so let's jump into it. So Koskenniemi, he starts off by questioning something that we often take for granted.
Yeah.
Which is this idea that punishment should be the main goal when we're dealing with crimes against humanity.
Right.
And he argues that when the scale of suffering is just so vast, right?
Yeah.
That achieving true justice through traditional punishment, it just might be impossible.
Yeah, he uses examples like the Nuremberg trials or the Eichmann trial to really illustrate that,
Yeah.
those trials weren't just about holding individuals accountable, but they were about exposing the horrors of the regimes, documenting the truth for history,
Right.
and helping societies to move forward from these atrocities that they experienced.
So if punishment isn't always the primary goal, then what is? Is it more about revealing the truth?
Yeah.
And preserving the memory of these events?
I think that's definitely a key aspect of it.
Okay.
And this actually ties into the whole concept of transitional justice.
Okay.
Which goes beyond just simply punishing individuals, right?
Right.
It's about addressing the aftermath of these mass atrocities.
Okay.
And helping society heal and rebuild trust and prevent future atrocities from happening.
I see.
And acknowledging the suffering of the victims and finding ways to move forward.
So it's a much broader approach than just focusing on retribution. Koskenniemi mentions the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission as an example, right?
Yes, he does.
I remember it being really controversial.
Yeah, the TRC was a prime example of transitional justice in action.
Okay.
And basically what they did was they offered amnesty to perpetrators in exchange for full confessions. You see? So it prioritized truth-telling and healing over traditional punishment.
Wow.
And it was very controversial, as you said,
Yeah.
with many critics arguing that it let perpetrators off way too easily.
Yeah, it seems like such a dilemma,
Yeah.
How do you balance the need for accountability with the desire for truth and reconciliation?
Right.
Especially when we're dealing with such, horrific crimes.
It's a very difficult balance to strike.
Yeah.
But the TRC, despite its flaws, did manage to bring to light a lot of hidden truths,
Right.
offered a platform for victims to share their stories, and it helped South Africa confront its painful past.
So it played a role in their transition to democracy,
Absolutely.
even if it wasn't perfect.
Yeah.
But this brings up another interesting question.
Okay.
Can there ever be a single objective truth when it comes to large-scale political events like these?
Well, Koskenniemi argues that there are often multiple truths and stakeholders, each with their own perspective on what happened and why.
Right.
He uses the Milosevic trial as a case in point.
Oh.
Milosevic, the former president of Serbia during the Yugoslav wars, he very cleverly used his defense to expose the West's own role in the conflict.
Right.
And challenge the dominant narrative that was being put forward.
So even in a trial that aims to uncover the truth,
Right.
the process itself can become a platform for competing narratives and interpretations.
Exactly.
It's a good reminder that we should always critically examine the information we're given and consider whose truth is being presented.
Yeah.
Why?
Absolutely. We need to be aware of the biases and agendas that might be shaping the narrative, especially when it comes to international conflicts,
Right.
Think about how often we only hear one side of the story.
That's a great point.
Right.
So let's dive into some specific trials now to see how they intertwine with historical narratives and national identities.
Okay.
Koskenniemi argues that trials can be powerful tools to shape memory
Yeah.
and influence how a nation sees itself,
Okay.
both domestically and on the world stage.
Right.
One of those striking examples is the Nuremberg trials.
Yes.
While they were groundbreaking in establishing international criminal law, Koskenniemi, he points out that the focus on prosecuting the crime of aggressive war
Right.
may have overshadowed the Holocaust.
Yeah. It's interesting.
There were also some notable omissions in the Nuremberg narrative, weren't there?
Yes. There were the Ribbentrop Pact, which was a secret agreement between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union to divide up Eastern Europe.
Right.
Is barely mentioned.
Wow.
And the role of the Wehrmacht, the German army in the atrocities, was also downplayed.
It's as if certain aspects of history were deliberately left out of the official story.
It makes you wonder why.
Right. It makes you wonder why. Like, was it a matter of political convenience, or perhaps the Allies were just unable to grasp the full extent of the Nazi crimes at that point?
It's likely a combination of factors, I think.
Yeah.
Remember, this was immediately after the war.
Right.
And there was a strong desire to move forward and rebuild and establish a new world order.
Right.
Confronting the full horror of the Holocaust might have been too overwhelming or too destabilizing at that moment.
And of course, the victors were writing the history.
Exactly.
They had a vested interest in shaping the narrative in a way that justified their actions.
Of course.
And solidified their position of moral authority.
Right.
So the Nuremberg trials, while a landmark achievement,
absolutely,
also show how legal truth and historical truth can diverge.
Yeah.
Especially when powerful political interests are at play.
It's fascinating.
Yeah, it's a fascinating example of how show trials can be used to shape public perception and solidify a particular version of history.
Right.
But what about other trials?
Yeah.
Did they serve a similar purpose?
Well, let's take a look at the Eichmann trial, which took place in Jerusalem in 1961.
Okay.
While it was highly successful in bringing the horrors of the Holocaust to wider public attention, Koskenniemi observes that the focus on Jewish resistance may have shifted the narrative away from the victims and towards a story of heroism.
So instead of solely highlighting the victimhood of the Jewish people, the trial emphasized their strength and resilience in the face of unimaginable suffering.
Precisely.
And while it's understandable given the context of the newly established state of Israel, this framing may have inadvertently obscured the sheer scale and brutality of the genocide.
Right.
It's a delicate balance, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Acknowledging the strength of the victims, while also ensuring that the full horror of the crimes isn't diminished.
Absolutely. And that brings us to two French trials that offer a different perspective on the relationship between show trials and justice.
Right.
The Touvier and Papon trials. These trials, which took place in the 1990s, forced France to confront its own complicity in the Holocaust.
Wow.
Exposing a dark chapter of its history that had long been downplayed or ignored.
So these trials brought to light a truth that had been buried for decades.
Exactly.
Forcing France to acknowledge its own role in the atrocities.
Yeah, both Touvier and Papon were French officials who had collaborated with the Nazi regime during the occupation.
Oh, wow.
And their trials revealed the extent to which the Vichy government had actively participated in the persecution of Jews.
And this was a deeply unsettling truth for France.
Right.
A nation that had long prided itself on its resistance to the Nazis.
It was a major challenge to their national myth.
Wow.
These trials forced a reckoning with the darker side of French history, and they showed how show trials can be used to unearth uncomfortable truths and challenge established narratives.
Yeah, it seems like these trials, especially those dealing with crimes against humanity, are rarely just about individual guilt or innocence.
No, they're not.
They inevitably become entangled with broader historical narratives, national identities, and political agendas.
Indeed. And that's what makes the question of whether show trials can serve justice so complex. You see, they can be used to manipulate and distort the truth, but they can also force a society to confront its past and acknowledge the suffering of victims.
So it all comes down to, like, how the trial is conducted.
Yes.
Whose voices are amplified.
Right.
And what narrative ultimately prevails.
Absolutely. So what we've seen so far is that show trials can be used for various purposes.
Right.
Sometimes to promote a particular narrative or ideology.
Yeah.
But how do they fit into the concept of trials of rupture? A term coined by legal scholar Jacques Verge.
Trials of rupture.
Yes.
What is that?
Well, this tactic highlights the inherent tension between seeking justice and preventing propaganda. In a trial of rupture, the accused, instead of simply defending themselves, aims to disrupt the proceedings, to expose hypocrisy, and challenge the legitimacy of the court itself.
So it sounds almost like a counter trial.
Yeah.
Turning the tables on the prosecution and using the courtroom as a platform for their own agenda.
Precisely. And to understand the strategy better, we need to delve deeper into the Milosevic trial. His defense was a prime example of trial of rupture in action.
That sounds fascinating.
Right.
Let's explore that further after a quick break. We'll be right back to unpack the Milosevic trial and see how this trial of rupture strategy played out.
Sounds good.
Stay tuned.
Welcome back, Deep Diver. Before the break, we were talking about show trials and how they can be used to shape narratives and unearth those uncomfortable truths.
Yeah.
So let's get into the Milosevic trial and how his defense strategy really turned the courtroom into a battleground over truth itself.
It sounds like he didn't just try to prove his innocence.
Oh,
he actually went on the offensive.
Exactly. Milosevic, representing himself, didn't simply deny the charges against him, but he used his platform to challenge the legitimacy of the tribunal.
Oh, wow.
And present his own interpretation of what happened during the Yugoslav wars.
So what was his angle? What was he trying to achieve by doing that?
Well, he argued that the tribunal was a tool of Western powers.
Okay.
Designed to scapegoat him and Serbia for a conflict that he believed was instigated by the West's own interference in the Balkans.
So instead of defending himself against the specific charges,
yes,
he was trying to shift the blame onto the West and portray himself as victim of their political machinations.
Precisely. He pointed to the West's support for the secession of republics like Slovenia, Croatia, and Bosnia as evidence of their desire to break up Yugoslavia and weaken Serbian influence. He even accused NATO of committing war crimes during the 1999 bombing of Serbia.
Wow.
Framing himself as a defender of Serbian sovereignty against Western aggression.
This trial of rupture strategy is fascinating.
It
seems like he was trying to use the trial to rewrite history.
Right.
To challenge the dominant narrative.
Yeah.
And to expose what he perceived as the West's hypocrisy. But did it work? Did it sway public opinion or undermine the tribunal's legitimacy?
It's hard to say definitively what the long-term impact will be.
Okay.
His defiant stance certainly resonated with many Serbs.
Right.
Reinforcing their belief that Serbia was a victim of Western aggression and that Milosevic was a martyr for the Serbian cause.
Okay.
But it also alienated many in the international community who saw him as a manipulative and unrepentant war criminal.
So the trial became a platform for competing narratives and interpretations.
Yes.
Was there any attempt to, control this or bring the focus back to the charges against Milosevic?
Well, the judges faced a very delicate balancing act.
Yeah.
They had to ensure a fair trial, allowing Milosevic to present his defense.
Right.
But they couldn't let the courtroom become a platform for propaganda or disinformation.
How did they handle this incredibly difficult situation?
They adopted a strategy of containment.
Okay.
They allowed Milosevic to speak, but frequently interrupted him, challenged his assertions, and limited the scope of his questioning.
Right.
They tried to steer the trial back to the specific charges against him, reminding him that the purpose was not to judge the actions of the West, but to determine his own guilt or innocence.
So it sounds like a constant struggle between Milosevic pushing his narrative and the judges trying to maintain control of the proceedings.
Exactly.
Did this strategy of containment ultimately succeed?
It's debatable.
Okay.
The trial was undoubtedly chaotic and contentious.
Yeah.
Milosevic felt muzzled. The prosecution felt constantly on the defensive. And the judges struggled to manage the competing narratives. And of course, the trial ended in a mistrial in 2006 when Milosevic died in his cell before a verdict could be reached.
Right.
So the question of his guilt or innocence remains unresolved.
It sounds like a very unsatisfying outcome for everyone involved.
Yes, it does.
Especially for those seeking justice and closure.
It certainly highlights the complexities of international justice and the challenges of adjudicating crimes that are deeply intertwined with political conflicts and competing historical narratives.
But even without a verdict, did the trial itself contribute anything to the idea of justice? Did it bring any truth to light or help with reconciliation?
I think the Milosevic trial offers a compelling case study of the inherent tensions and contradictions of show trials. On the one hand, it showed how these trials can be manipulated to promote propaganda and distort historical narratives.
Yeah.
Milosevic's trial of rupture strategy was a masterclass in turning the tables on the prosecution and using the courtroom as a stage for political theater.
But on the other hand, the very fact that the trial took place, that Milosevic was forced to answer for his actions, and that his narrative was challenged and scrutinized, that had significant impact on the historical record.
Absolutely.
And public perceptions of the conflict.
It also offered a platform for victims to share their stories.
Right.
And for the international community to condemn the atrocities that had occurred.
So it seems that even a trial as messy and controversial as this one can have both negative and positive consequences.
Right.
It can be used to distort the truth, but also to bring certain aspects of it to light.
That's precisely the paradox we've been exploring with show trials.
Yeah.
They are inherently complex, and their impact can be multifaceted.
Right.
They can be used for propaganda, for truth-telling, and sometimes even for both simultaneously.
Oh, yeah.
The Milosevic trial really vividly illustrates this duality.
It reminds us that justice is rarely black and white. And it underscores the need for critical thinking, especially when dealing with events that are just loaded with political and emotional baggage.
We must be wary of simplistic narratives and easy answers.
Right.
It's crucial to embrace the complexity and ambiguity that often accompany these trials.
So, deep divers, as we delve into the final part of our exploration, let's keep in mind what we've learned from the Milosevic trial. It's a stark reminder that the pursuit of justice is a complex and multifaceted journey.
Absolutely.
Stay tuned as we wrap up our deep dive into show trials and justice. Okay, deep diver, we're back and ready to wrap up our exploration of show trials and justice.
Time flies when you're having a deep dive.
It really does. We've uncovered so many intriguing insights from the philosophical questions about punishment to the real world complexities of international law.
Yeah, we've really gone deep.
Yeah, so after this deep dive into show trials, what are the key takeaways? What should our listeners be pondering as they move forward?
I think one of the most important lessons is that show trials are rarely clear-cut morality plays with obvious heroes and villains, you know?
Right.
The reality is much more nuanced and a lot more gray.
It seems like every trial we've discussed is deeply intertwined with political agendas, historical interpretations, competing narratives of truth.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, and I think we need to remember that even in trials aimed at exposing atrocities and seeking accountability, the process itself can be shaped by power dynamics and hidden agendas that don't always align with the pure pursuit of justice.
It's kind of unsettling, isn't it?
Yeah.
To think that these trials, which are meant to deliver justice, can be influenced by so many external factors.
It's a reminder that we need to be critical thinkers, especially when we're engaging with information about these complex historical events.
Yeah, but we've also seen how these trials, despite their flaws, can play a role in shaping public understanding and historical narratives.
Yeah. Absolutely. The very act of putting these issues on trial, bringing them into the public sphere and subjecting them to scrutiny can have a really profound impact, both positive and negative, on how a society comes to terms with its past and its present.
So they can be used for manipulation, but also to bring forth uncomfortable truths and force a reckoning with history.
Exactly. The Milosevic trial, with its blend of legal process, political theater, and historical revisionism, is a perfect example. It really showed us how the courtroom can become a battleground for competing narratives.
It definitely wasn't a straightforward trial.
Not at all.
Milosevic's trial of rupture strategy really threw a wrench into the proceedings.
It did.
And highlighted the tension between allowing the accused a fair defense and preventing the spread of propaganda.
His case really reminds us that the pursuit of justice is rarely simple. It's a complex journey, filled with ambiguity and often unsatisfying outcomes.
Definitely. So it underscores the importance of transparency and critical thinking.
Yes.
We must be wary of falling for simplistic narratives and easy answers.
Absolutely. We must engage with these complex issues thoughtfully, consider multiple perspectives, and resist the urge to reduce these events to black and white pronouncements.
So show trials, as we've learned, are multifaceted.
Definitely.
They can be used for good or ill, and their legacy often remains open to debate.
That's a good point.
So what's the final verdict?
Well, ultimately, I think it's up to each of us as individuals to grapple with these challenging questions and to continue to learn from these historical events.
That's a great point to end on. So, deep divers, as we conclude this exploration of show trials and justice, remember to keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.
Always.
Thanks for joining us.